We are in the midst of a fascinating discussion of the relationship between soul and nature, and the facets of that relationship by which the soul can rise from a relationship of dependence and even enslavement to a relationship of freedom and lordship and enjoyment in that freedom and lordship. And all of this discussion of the entire chapter is in the backdrop of an earlier part of the discussion where Sri Aurobindo showed us the underlying unity of all reality, and then decided to take up step by step the various principles in creation in which we can now begin to see that unity. The first principle that he took up is of soul and nature, a position which is by very definition a division of existence. Soul is that part of our consciousness which is aware, but its awareness is not the movement which is nature. Nature, by definition, is a movement of energy, of life. Soul, by definition, is a poise of consciousness not involved in the movement, or the correct words in Sanskrit would be Purusha, as that poise, and Prakriti, the creative power, literally in the root sense of the Sanskrit word, the creative movement, which is nature. And these two, as we have seen in many traditions, are irreconcilable. They have to be separate. But Sri Aurobindo leads us through a 6-step process in which this relationship is changed with each step until not only the soul emerges into a poise of freedom, lordship, and an enjoyment of that freedom and lordship, but also from there, through the next portion which we will read today, it unites itself with the divine movement in the universe and the divine knowledge and will in the universe. And finally, in the portion which we will see in the last paragraph of this chapter, Sri Aurobindo will link both soul and nature to aspects of the Satchidananda. And at that point we will see them unified in a consciousness which is also power of consciousness, which is also delight of consciousness. And these two, soul and nature, will be united in delight, in this poise of consciousness and power of consciousness. And so I have anticipated what will come for the rest of the chapter, but now we will review the text and the 6 poises we have seen. To quickly summarize, are first the position of the observer, Sakshi, where the consciousness separates itself from the movement. And the second poise is the upholder, Bharta, where the consciousness recognizes that because it is watching, because it is supporting, therefore the movement continues. If consciousness were to withdraw, the movement would collapse, as happens to us when we go to sleep, for example. And then it recognizes also that in its support, implied is that it chooses what it supports. And so the third status is one of sanctioner, where it supports certain things and not other things. And the practical result is, as the soul chooses the poise, the play of nature undergoes a modification according to the support. We saw an example when, for example, we observe our own thoughts, our own emotions, our own instinctive reactions, and at first we can stand back from them and say, well, this is instinct, this is habit, this is how my nature is. By temperament I am pessimistic or optimistic, or by temperament my mind is hyperactive, or my emotions or energies are more tend towards inertia. But that poise is of a detached observer. And what Sri Aurobindo shows is implied in this is the poise of the sanction giver, the upholder first. The upholder as, because I accept this poise, it can continue. Because I accept that my nature is lazy, it can continue to be lazy. Because I accept that my mind is hyperactive, it continues to remain. The moment I shift my poise and I say, but I don't wish to be like this, and just that shift creates a ripple in nature. You are not directly engaging with the thought, just the shift in the poise of your consciousness and the way you know yourself begins the ripple, which begins to change things. In practice, these first 3 steps are codified in a particular technique taught in the Raja Yoga, that you step back from your thoughts and observe them. When you thus begin to observe, after a while you notice you actually see the thoughts entering your mind, you see them doing their thing, and very often you discover quickly that your mind is such a chaos of activity. But then you are taught that if you wait long enough, eventually the activity subsides and your thought becomes calm. Now here's the catch. It does not happen always to everyone. You observe the thought and you might just say, well, this is how it is, and I'm upset even in some part of me that this is how it is, and the activity increases. On the other hand, when you accept that this is not how it should be, that the activity is supposed to calm down, where is it calming down? And because your intention has turned towards the idea that it should calm down, it begins to calm down. So implied in the very exercise is the suggestion given that by remaining quiet and observing, when you become quiet in your poise of observer, the thoughts also will settle down and become quiet. And you see here basically the principle of upholder and the principle of sanction giver, which is active, not always explicitly stated like this though, but just the idea that it's going to be like this is enough to trigger off a shift in the play of your nature. Now this principle is extremely important. It comes as a subtle suggestion within us and works in a subtle way. Somebody tells you in childhood that you know this is how it is, and when your consciousness accepts that this is how it is, you become the upholder or sanction giver of this is how it should be. So you're taught in childhood, and you see this programming in cinema, in television advertisements for medicine for cough and cold. A child is playing in the garden, it's raining, and he comes home and he sneezes. And mom says, oh, and then she applies this balm on his chest. He breathes the balm smell and he is fine. The suggestion given, and this is now taught to the children, if you get wet in the rain, you will catch a cold. And somewhere in your consciousness, you become the sanction giver of this falsehood, of this habit, of this relationship with your body and with your emotions or your nature. So much of the relationship of our consciousness with our mind, emotions and body is the result of a sanction given by some understanding that we have had, by some acceptance of that understanding that we have got used to. And increasingly with science telling you things with an authority, you are even taught it's the result of your genetics. It is your heredity which makes you like this. And in the acceptance of that tendency, where you say, well, it's my heredity, I can do nothing, is the implied sanction that, well, this can now continue because I have accepted my heredity. On the other hand, if from the beginning we have been taught that everything in your nature is the result of a sanction, sometimes the sanction you have inherited, the tendency can change if you change your sanction. If you change your poise of consciousness, if you refuse that this should be so, in your consciousness, your nature will follow and the habits will change. And so these first 3 steps have brought us to a poise where the active sanction can be given more and more frequently, leading to an active control. But how is the control happening? Because you are still the observing consciousness. And then we come to the next 3 stages of the relationship of soul with nature. The knower, Jnata, lordship, Ishvara, and the enjoyer, Bhokta. And Sri Aurobindo skillfully weaves these together. First that, what is nature reflecting? What you know yourself to be. I know myself to be a good person. And while I may make mistakes, while I may get carried away occasionally in moments of passion or confusion or some momentary drive of habit or instinct, I will only do good when I can, and I will correct any mistake I make. Just that idea that I am a good person and I feel myself to be good will create a ripple in the play of nature, which will begin to align itself around this sense of goodness. The fact that I know myself to be a consciousness that is calm and free makes for the fact that the thoughts that I am observing now begin to calm down and become free of their habit. And then in my emotions, when I turn my attention to my emotions with the same idea in my awareness that I am a calm person, then the emotions begin to calm themselves. And then the same thing could be taken all the way into the body consciousness. I am resilient, I am free of illness, and gradually the body begins to become stronger and more resilient. But you must turn the awareness to that for that effect to happen. This principle we will see shortly is extremely important. As long as you are not conscious of your thought processes happening, you could tell yourself, I am a calm person, and it would be more an exercise in self-deception. But when I become conscious of my thoughts, I separate myself from the thoughts, and I know that my observing consciousness is calm, and the thoughts have to reflect that reality. Without doing anything, simply remaining in my calm that I am, the thoughts begin to settle. But I have to hold that awareness in the relationship of my observing consciousness and my nature. So when I turn, for example, in the body's tendencies, when I find in my body ranges which I am not conscious of, my attempt to become or to bring that calm into that part will be to that extent less effective, or will take longer because they will ripple through nature into her darker corners. To the extent that that part becomes conscious and is lit up into the awareness of my observer status, the action is more rapid, immediate, and lasting. And this we will see how important it becomes when we shift to the poise of universality of consciousness. So first we see the shift to become the knower is what changes things. In that sense, he says, we enter the secret of fate, because what we are is what nature will become. In the Bhagavad Gita, from which Sri Aurobindo draws this sixfold facet of vocabulary of soul's relationship with nature, there is another interesting concept which comes, which is directly related to this discussion, where Sri Krishna says, and Sri Aurobindo quotes that in other spaces in his writings, Yo yat shraddheya sa eva sa. That literal translation will be something like this: that which is your faith, that is what you are. Turned into more conventional English, it will be whatever you have faith in, that is what you will become. But it's not so much that. It is What you are as a faith is what you become. And the sense of the word Shraddha, used in Sanskrit, is more than the English equivalent in the word faith. Faith, of course, we make a distinction in English between belief and faith. Belief is something which you have acquired from outside. It's like a coating of paint, but it can be washed off. It's not you. Faith is what you know innately in yourself. Do you know that you exist? Is a question which you can have a belief. Actually, I don't exist. Actually, I am a system of electrical signals in my brain produced by cells which are just part of molecules which fell into place by chance a few billion years ago. That's your belief. What's your experience? I know I exist. Where does that come from? From an innate knowledge in which I am what I know. In a belief, what I know is separate from what I am. I have learned from my studies that I am a bundle of neurons. That's belief. Tomorrow that changes and a new science will tell you something else. You are just a bundle of energy. Even neurons are an illusion. Okay, so I know I am a bundle of energy. Someone else says, I am genetics. It's all belief. But when you turn into yourself, what do I know in identity? That is your faith. What you are as a faith is what you become, Sri Krishna says. If you go into the root of the word Shraddha in Sanskrit, Sri Aurobindo explains this root. Dha is the same root as the dharma, upholding, containing, holding, clinging to. And Shrat is the essential truth of your being. Shraddha is that which is clinging to the essential truth of your being. And that's why it is something which is so innate. You are what you know in your essential truth. Do you know yourself to be immortal? And if you go to the essential truth of your being, you know. If you're not there, well, you're still a few layers away from it, but when you get there, you just know it is so. And that's why all in our thoughts, in our actions, we tend to behave as if we will live forever. Somewhere inside that knowledge is there, is your Shraddha. And in any action in the world, you will find eventually what is your faith is what you become. A creator, an artist, painter, for example, draws to reveal something beautiful. Where does that beauty come from? And if you go deep into the whole process, you realize finally, if the person does not feel and experience that beauty within, he or she cannot articulate and express it. What you create eventually expresses what you are within. You can see this sometimes quite dramatically. The same artist, when upset and agitated, does a drawing and it is all broken, confused, and not at all beautiful. The same artist becoming centered, and the whole thing flows and expresses the beauty. Anything you do eventually will be an expression of what you are within internally. When I've used this example before many times, in the Olympics, when a gymnast is about to perform something difficult, there is a moment of poise, of concentration, in which the gymnast is entirely at one with herself. And then suddenly she moves. Or rather, it's as if that state of silence moves to become the performance. And if you see that the silence, stillness moves into action, you know in the very first movement it will be successful. If instead the person now gets nervous, is disturbed because there are 1,000 people shouting and screaming, in a brief moment there is a misalignment from that center of stillness, you know that there will be a slip up. That experience we have as an audience gives you the clue that eventually all action, all expression is emerging from what you are. And it is this which Sri Aurobindo describes as the poise of knowledge, the jnata. And from there, as you become aware of possibilities within you, I never knew I had within me the musician. But when I become conscious there is the musician, the music begins to flow. By drawing out in my consciousness all that I am, the movement in nature now begins to reflect and follow. And at no point have I got into the activity. I still am in awareness. And by so playing and so applying my awareness, knowledge, I grow into mastery. I grow into the lordship. And with it comes inevitably the enjoyment of that play, of that self-revelation, of that creative movement. I become the enjoyer. Now these 6 poises in sequence bring us to the status of freedom. At this point, Sri Aurobindo says, you have entered a poise where not only you are enjoyer, but you are master in the enjoyment, and your poise is a full knowledge of what it is that will eventually unfold. Now sometimes we have an experience of this in a very narrow way. When you begin a project, and especially if it is inspired, even at the first step of the project, you know it's going to succeed. You know the resources will come. Although right now here on the surface you don't know how you will do it. You know somehow it's going to be done. And that comes from this poise of consciousness, which is somewhere within. Not yet your conscious center, but the fact that it's there shows you that it is possible for you to even live in such a poise. But that's what it feels like when you begin to live in it all the time. And so Sri Aurobindo says, in this, there is no loss of freedom, no descent into an ignorant attachment. The poise of equality of the witness, the Sakshi, is still present. But now you are equally the enjoyer in lordship. The man free in his soul is aware that the divine is the lord of the action of nature, that Maya is his knowledge will determining and effecting all, that force is the will side of this double divine power in which knowledge is always present and effectual. So this is the next sentence from where we left off last time. What is happening in this movement of nature when I am thus free and enjoying? Who is controlling nature and driving it? So as an individual, when I look at this scene of the world, we saw already before, Sri Aurobindo has used these 3 words, God, force or nature or Maya are doing it. That's how it appears to the witness. And these are 3 facets of the relationship with the power that drives nature. In the first, it is as if there is someone or something which has as if set in place in motion all this that is happening. Science will say it is the Big Bang which released the energy and the energy drives. Religion will say it is God sitting somehow as a person or personality which presides over all this creation. Whatever vocabulary we use, we have the sense that there is something which has intended all this movement to happen. Now this can also be experienced in a lesser way, and we look at a few examples. When you enter a space like a forest, especially if it's late in the evening, you can feel that the entire forest is like a person. And there's even a vocabulary that spontaneously comes up in you which says, I can feel the forest is inviting me. Or such and such a space does not want this to happen, does not want you to do something. You enter a silent space in nature and you feel there's something sacred here which does not want to be disturbed. The sense that it is almost like a conscious being is implied in all these kinds of relationship. But when you look at all of nature, It's as if there is a conscious being behind, supporting, presiding over, from whom all this happens, or who makes all this happen. So this is the first relationship. And from this poise of freedom in the soul, who is the Lord of the action of nature? This divine being, presence, consciousness. Something that exists which is conscious. Or the other way of looking at it is that there has always been a power, a skillful power, which has been working behind the scenes. She knows exactly what she is doing, skillfully makes things happen. When you look at the complex interdependence of nature, of the environment, of the forest, you'll find everything is precisely balanced with everything else. If the tiger is dependent on eating the deer, the population of the deer is always so maintained that it supports the population of the tiger. And the tiger population never overeats the deer to extinction, nor does it ever happen that the tiger fades out and becomes extinct and the deer becomes too much. And the rhythm of the balance is going through rhythms, sometimes more of this, sometimes more of that, but it's maintained. And when you go deep into the processes of nature, you discover this is somehow tied to a particular bird which is changing something in the environment which makes for the pollination upon which the deer is dependent. And on the other side, the water supply here and its seasonal fluctuation is influencing the tiger population. And it's all so complexly interdependent that if human beings enter that system and suddenly break one tiny part, it breaks down the entire ecosystem. It bounces back again by a complex knowledge that has guided the power. And so we see in nature, behind the appearances, this extraordinary, skillful, cunning knowledge, wisdom, which we call Maya. Maya, used in its original sense in the Veda, is this power that creates. The root in Sanskrit, Maya, is measuring out. The power which measures out to create form and appearance. Out of the infinite, she measures out a finite appearance. And she holds all the finite appearances in a complex interplay, always held in the hands or the arms of the infinite. Always the infinite nourishes the finites play, each leads eventually or connects back to the infinite. And this power which can carve out, so to say, the appearance of finite, dependent, interdependent appearances of finiteness out of one indivisible infinity, that is Maya. But what a cunning, what an extraordinary intelligence, what a skill. These are the aspects of Maya which are dominating. In the later vocabulary, because of this aspect of skillful formation, creating of forms and limits, Maya took on the appearance of an illusory power. Because in the later Vedanta, the world was seen as an illusion compared to the reality and the absolute. And therefore, this is the creative power which creates a screen that hides behind it the reality and the absolute. But that's not the original sense in the Veda, and Sri Aurobindo is not using it in this sense either. Sri Aurobindo is using it in this sense that there's some kind of an intelligence that's making all this happen. We saw the example of last time in our own lives. Sometimes we just know that it will happen. How does it happen? I met someone by chance who said this, who did that, and a whole series of links fell into place and the work was done. If you go back to the sequences behind every little detail that fell into place, it's as if out of an infinity of possibilities, some intelligence brought this person in place at that right moment when I spilt a cup and the person happened to be passing by, picked it up and gave it to me. And I spoke this word and they spoke that word, and we discovered that this was exactly what was required to solve the problem. Just happened by chance. Except it's not by chance, there is this wisdom, this intelligence working to make it happen. And so we recognize this aspect of the appearance of nature, that Maya is his knowledge will. And knowledge hyphen will means knowledge as will, an active knowledge working itself out. Is his knowledge will determining and effecting all. And then the third facet with which we saw nature, and this is much closer to the physical science perspective, but also in many traditions, it's a force. A force that's somehow working out, no logic. It is following rules, it is following laws, and it just keeps doing what it has to be doing, and that's all there is to it. The Greeks had a term for it, ananke, meaning necessity, something which has to compel itself to happen, but we don't know what and why. That's how it is. It's a gigantic, complex, mechanical machinery or force. But it is only force. We do not see, obviously, intelligence. If there is intelligence, that just happens to be so. And so in this third view of nature, Sri Aurobindo explains, as the soul awakes to the divine, we realize also that force is the will side of this double divine power in which knowledge is always present and effectual. You can look at nature as this will side of the activity. The knowledge is there but hidden behind. Or you can look at it as this knowledge which is effecting itself as will, Maya. Or you can look at it as this divine being of whom this is the knowledge and this the will. But there are three different ways of looking at nature, and eventually in this awakened state of consciousness, the three resolve themselves in a single vision, one divine whose knowledge and will are working out in nature and as nature. So I reread this. The man free in his soul is aware that the divine is the lord of the action of nature, that Maya is his knowledge will determining and effecting all, that force is the will side of this double divine power in which knowledge is always present and effectual. He is aware of himself also, even individually, as a center of the divine existence, a portion of the Lord, the Gita expresses it, controlling so far the action of nature that he views, upholds, sanctions, enjoys, knows, and by the determinative power of knowledge, controls. So now we come to something extremely important. The deeper truth of this relationship between soul and nature. You discover you are yourself a part of that, of the divine. So, a center of the divine existence as an individual center, and a portion of the Lord, the Gita expresses it. The moment your consciousness is a part of the divine consciousness, then his relationship with nature is now reflected in you, but in a limited way. To the extent that you are a part of the whole divine consciousness, your influence on nature or relationship with nature is also reflecting that relationship of God with his power and knowledge. And so we are coming to something very profound. Because we are secretly one with the divine, therefore this poise of the witness consciousness is possible to separate yourself from nature. But also therefore, as the poise of your consciousness shifts and you take up the aspect of upholder, sanction giver, knower, master and enjoyer, so nature changes because it's the same relationship of the divine with his whole nature that is being replicated here in this part of the divine and the limited part of nature that is associated with it. So, controlling so far the action of nature which he views, upholds, sanctions, enjoys. So now comes this question, what is the part of nature that we view, uphold, sanction, enjoy? And when we dwell into this, we discover something extraordinary. It is our choice of how much of nature we choose to view, uphold, sanction, enjoy. We begin with a very small part even of ourselves. Or to begin with, we may not even view any of it as nature which is ours to relate to. It's happening, and I, as a conscious center, am lost in what's happening. I am literally the tool of nature. I feel I am formed out of these thoughts, out of these emotions, out of this body. If somehow this body was knocked out, I would cease to be. If somehow the thoughts were removed, I would no more be conscious. And so I feel myself a product of this flow of nature. When I begin to disengage and become a witness, separating myself from my body, separating from my emotions, separating from my thoughts, I see, oh, I have a body. Whether I have this body or not, I will still be observing. I have emotions, but I am not emotions. I have thoughts, and I am not thoughts. And whether the thoughts stop or they intensify in activity, I am still separate. And so having taken this poise, where is this poise relating to in nature? So far in the example we took, it was to my thoughts. Or I turn my awareness now to include my emotions. Or I turn my awareness to include my body and even its sensations and its instincts. And last time we saw the example also how the awareness now turning to the sensations of the body can even change how it registers the sensations. Reprogram, so to say, even the body responses, even as it can change entirely the cast of the mind and its habitual thoughts and the cast of the emotions and their habitual forms of character. But it can also turn to something wider. Why only limit with the body? There's one simple reason for that. Because we have the most direct sense of sensations because of the nervous system with the body. Because I am consciousness that is plugged into the body and formed out of my body, therefore I am limited by the boundaries of my physical body. Because my mind is bound in the body and formed by the body, therefore my sensations are limited to my body's limits. But is this true when you take the poise of the conscious witness? I am not body, I have a body. So what am I? I have not only body, I have clothes. I am not mobile phone, I have mobile phone. To what extent is the mobile phone a part of me? As much as my body. You could cut off my hand, I would still be me, my body would be damaged. You could take away my mobile phone, I would still be me, but my access to what the mobile phone gives would be limited as my hands would be constrained by the loss of fingers. How far is the space that is mine? And if you dwell upon this, you realize from the pure witness poise, potentially there is no limit. It's only as far as you choose to exercise the range of your awareness from the position of witness. I look at the room around me. Oh, it is dusty. I don't like it. It should change. It is a part of me. It is my room, my house, as much as my body. What is the difference? Significantly nothing. And therefore, all those things begin to change also. The actions change. My body nature and other natures now begin to activate, to make it cleaner, to rearrange, and so on. The mother makes this interesting observation that if you go into somebody's room and see how their things are arranged, you get a pretty good idea of what they are internally. Because the external arrangement of objects in your room is a reflection of the arrangement of the objects within you. Every object there corresponds to something in your consciousness, and the way they are arranged internally is reflected externally. You go into someone's house, everything is neatly, perfectly arranged, simply, and that's how they are internally. Some people have it extremely complex, maybe even in what appears to be disorder, but they know exactly where everything is. In the middle of the night with eyes closed, they can reach out and grab exactly what they need. It's internally arranged, externally reflected in a perfect arrangement, but not order of beauty. There are others in whom the order of beauty is there, but they don't know what is where. And these are variations of the internal poise and the internal state of consciousness, of harmony or order, etc. So, in a sense, we could say your room space arrangement is an extension of your consciousness. And so, let's reread what that means. Controlling. So, he is aware of himself also, even individually, as a center of the divine existence, a portion of the Lord, the Gita expresses it. Controlling so far the action of nature, which he views, upholds, sanctions, enjoys, knows, and by the determinative power of knowledge, controls. So the key is this: controlling so far the action of nature which he views and then follows in the sequence. Now it may happen that you view many more things. You're aware not only of what is happening in your room, but you're aware of the larger space around you, in the house, beyond the house, within your community, within your country, in the world, maybe even in the universe, because you're an avid follower of space explorations and photography and whatever else associated with it, sciences. But that is the poise which you have as a view. But what do you uphold? None of those things are part of your uphold. Where is the space limiting where you say, I am responsible for this? It may be your house physically, or the immediate range outside the house within the community. To the extent that you uphold it, that space will begin to reflect the poise of your consciousness. Now it's interesting to see how this works. There are people in whom inside the house they do not uphold even their own space. They live in a kind of a little bubble of a personal cocoon, and they move around in the house, in the room, but if you ask, why is this so? That's somebody else, they have done this. Oh, this is not clean, the maid didn't clean it. I do not feel responsible. So the poise of upholder has not extended, although the poise of witness has extended into that space. I'm aware it's there, but it's not my responsibility. The moment you begin to feel the responsibility, notice what happens. There are people who walk in the street and some dirt has fallen. They will pick it up and put it in the bin. It's not theirs. Somebody else dropped it, but they will pick it up and put it in the bin. Why? They feel responsible for it. Now here's the interesting part. You as a witness in the center, it's not required that you do it. It's only required that you shift your poise to include this space in your responsibility. The result is, as you're walking, your hand reaches out, picks it up, and does it. Your nature follows because it reflects your poise of consciousness and the relationship that you have chosen to set up. And then the next step, we go to from the sense of upholding to sanctioning. How much do you actively sanction? And this is interesting. If your witness space is large, your upholding space is smaller, your sanctioning space tends to become even smaller. Generally though, if you feel responsible, then you've already put an affirmative part of the sanction into that space. Otherwise, I feel responsible, but I don't know if I can act. I might upset somebody else. Or in the sanction, basically it's a shift from the poise of upholder where you choose a preference of this over that. And then the sanction giver becomes more and more frequent. Where do you do that? Again, a narrower space. Within my home, it is frequent sanction. Outside my home it is less frequent. But then when somebody encourages me and they appreciate, oh, your flowers are so beautifully kept, the lawn is so well trimmed, I'm so glad that you cleaned that up, you are enthused. And now the sanction shifts more frequently into those spaces. Until before I know it, I am the unofficial gardener in my community. And everybody turns to me and says, can you please take a look at that, something is wrong, and I enjoy it. So the whole space now has come into my domain, where increasingly my poise of knowledge and lordship begins to reflect into that space, and I am the enjoyer. Now this is extremely important, because we come back to the idea, you choose how far you extend this relationship. So controlling so far the action of nature, which he views, upholds, sanctions, enjoys, knows, and by the determinative power of knowledge controls. Now why has he put after enjoys, knows, and by the determinative power of knowledge controls? Because in practice, when we begin to expand our domain of influence, I will put in this way, controller of the action, it begins with this first. Simply at first you are viewing, then upholding, sanctioning, and with it the enjoyment aspect comes first. I enjoy the fact that I'm able to make this a beautiful space, that all these things are happening. But I'm still not fully aware in knowledge. That part is still concealed. As that grows, with it comes the effective power of the knowledge. Now I'm going to dwell upon this a little more, because this is what follows in the expansion of your consciousness and influence. The more you become aware of something in knowledge, the more the effective action grows. I'm going to take an example here of Sri Aurobindo when he was influencing his environment. He sees a bird flying, and he puts an intention that the bird should change direction. And the bird turns around halfway and then goes back to where it was going. And he marks it out in his diary. And of course later he is able to make the complete turn. But what in the relationship with the bird made the bird change? That link in consciousness which is of awareness. So it's like this. You move your fingers. Let's say your hands are shaking. What do? You will it to stop. What do you do when you will it to stop? First you become aware of your hand, and then you bring into it a calm stillness, and it stops. Okay? You have to bring awareness into it which makes possible the action of the will. If you did not bring awareness into it, the hand is doing something, I'm sorry, I can't control it. It's not my hand. But the moment the nerves are cut or they're somehow damaged, the link is gone in my consciousness, I cannot do anything. I bring the link back, I have with awareness, with knowledge, this power of knowledge. So the determinative power of knowledge which controls. Again, if your consciousness is not bound to your body, where does it go? I take the flower. As long as flower is other than I, my consciousness is limited and separate from it, well, it does what it does, its nature follows its chain. When in my consciousness I become aware of the flower, I am able to feel the flower itself as consciousness in me. In some sense, it's become a part of my consciousness. Then I can change my relationship, my poise of the sanction giver, and I wish the flower to remain, not fade. And in that relationship that I have set, I don't have to do anything to the flower. That changes the working of nature. To the extent that the knowledge was there, the determinative power of knowledge controls and changes the working of the flower. There's an example, I mean, of course these we go back to examples from the mothers and Sri Aurobindo's lives. The person in charge of the fruit room in the ashram in the days when there was no refrigerator, had to manage the fruits and their distribution every day. Except that fruits are seasonal and sometimes they come in gigantic lots. So once there was a large number of oranges that came, and the mother by then had already reduced her food drastically. She had shifted to taking more of juices, less of solid foods. So she told him, "Can you keep these oranges in the fruit room and give me the juice of 2 oranges every day?" And the fellow says, "Mother, how is that possible? They will all get spoilt." And mother tells him, "Well, just do as I have asked." And he says, the next day, half the oranges had spoilt. He reported to the mother, and mother said, "Just do as I asked." And the second day, none of the oranges had spoilt. The third day, none of them had spoilt. And every day he would take 2 oranges and give the juice to the mother until the entire stock was finished. And then he asked the mother, "How is it that the first day, the half of the oranges had spoilt?" And she said, "Because you didn't have faith." Now here is a vehicle used indirectly, an intention placed, which changes the working of nature, at least within those oranges, which she held in her consciousness. But there was this dependent element who was the intermediary to manage the oranges, where there was a, let's say, gap. And the result of the gap was that half the oranges spoilt the first day. But after that, once he gave up, once he set aside, okay, it's going to happen anyway, he let go, it could work more freely. But in this way, the moment one brings something into one's consciousness, to the extent that it comes into your consciousness, the shift in your poise of sanction giver can change its working. Now, the implications of this are enormous. First, as I said, you can choose how much comes into it. To the extent that your consciousness now expands to include more, but in the sense of the true sense of knowledge. Not I'm aware there's a flower out there, but I am in consciousness, in the witness poise, one with the witness poise of flower consciousness. Then I can will as I will in my own body for the same thing to change. I want my hand to stay up. After a while, the muscle gets tired. What do? No, I refuse to let it go. I refuse to let it fall. Until at some point, nature overwhelms me and the hand collapses from the muscle tearing or something. But till then, I can choose. But there's a limit because the actual muscular process is not in my consciousness. If I bring that into my consciousness and uphold from within, then there will be no muscle tearing. Then I can hold it for as long as I want. As long as my consciousness is superficially related to the hand movement, I have a superficial degree of control or mastery over it. When it is intimately related to the consciousness of the arm, the hand, the muscle, even the cells, their entire working can undergo a shift because of my shift of consciousness. Now, all of this will have enormous implications which will be discussed in the next chapter, where Sri Aurobindo says that once we recognize that nature is not other than us, then we have to include in the liberation of the soul, we have to include also the liberation of nature. And the whole character of the yoga changes as a result. But I'm anticipating, but you get a glimpse here of where this could go. But you also understand the principle upon which you are able to master seemingly magically things which are not in your body. If I can move my body by exactly the same process of consciousness, I can influence or move another object than my body. This is the basis for a lot of parapsychological phenomena. In an example which I will give, that was from a center in Bangalore which had equipment that has these random number generators, which reflect in some way your consciousness. And it's a test that people do to see if you can influence it. Some people are able to, some people not. So the people who were experimenting with this device, they invited many spiritually great people, famous people. Most of them couldn't do anything. But they said one person was very successful. And he was formerly Chief Election Commissioner in India, man of great vitality. He came there and he was told, can you influence this random number generator? And after a while, yes, it did drop in its randomness. So they asked him, what did you do? He said, I didn't try to influence it. I made myself calm. And then the thing changed. You see, it's the same idea here. You change your poise of consciousness, but you must hold that in your awareness of the witness. And as you change your state, that changes. And here is the secret of that influence that Sri Aurobindo had in increasingly larger spaces, eventually as his consciousness joined with the universal and with the divine, even on circumstances and events in the world. But not by doing it like that, by shifting the poise and thereby the ripple effect that follows. When people were given that device and told to influence it, most people went, that's not how it works. You're only agitating yourself, which makes it agitate. You let go, holding it in your awareness, you become quiet and calm, and it follows. You meet an animal, the dog is agitated, or it's the horse is very restless, and you say, calm down, calm down, calm down. It's not going to happen. You're only throwing more energy of excitement. You become quiet. But it's not enough if you become quiet in yourself. You must hold the animal, the horse or the dog, in your awareness. And as you become quiet, you pull it into quietness. And the result is there. There are people, they're called horse whisperers or dog whisperers. They have this magical ability. You can bring to them the most wild, the most restless creature, and in a few minutes they have the horse or the dog completely under their influence and listening to them, taking their orders, and happily. And if you observe them in the very first few moments of interaction, they connect and then they shift to the poise of this first witness, upholder, sanction giver, and then from there lordship and enjoyer in knowledge. But the knowledge is that part which is the most difficult to complete, and that's why he puts the knowledge last after enjoys, and then knows, and by the determinative power of knowledge controls. In the knowledge, in the awareness is this power to shift. One of the most interesting examples is Ingo Swann. He was artist in New York who they discovered had this extraordinary powers, could influence objects, and he would do this easily. They would leave objects wired to machinery to measure, and then he would put his intention there, and after a while the resistor will heat up. And of course he had difficulty explaining what he was doing. In one case they took him to a lab, and he was told, you just go for a few minutes and see if you can influence. We have this extraordinary device, one of the most sophisticated, what they call Hall effect detector, which is held in near zero absolute, that is minus whatever, 273 degrees, something. And see if you can influence it. So he says, okay, I have a few minutes before lunch, let's go. He's taken into a room and the room is empty. So he asks, where is your detector? And he says, he's told, you're standing on top of it. And there was a little device there which was registering the signals from that. And he looks down and there's only a flat concrete block. And he said, my condition, I cannot do this, I cannot influence something unless I can see it. How am I supposed to see this if it's covered in concrete? So they say, well, just do what you can, try. So here's the interesting thing. He turns his mind now, what's it like inside? And his mind is trying to feel, And then he takes a pencil and paper and he's feeling something and he says, I think this is it. Does it look like that? And he sketches the Hall effect device. And at the moment where he says, does it look like that, and starts sketching, the indicator, the machine goes crazy and marks crazy signals. And he stops, lets go, and it falls back to its normal pattern. And so this is recorded as one of the dramatic events. Here's this multi-million-dollar device which is supposed to be completely isolated and protected to detect some cosmic ray signals, and a man comes and not only is able to sense it and describe it, but he makes it go crazy. What did he do? He brought his awareness, or rather he brought it into his awareness, and the moment when the contact of awareness was there, it changed to reflect his state of awareness. Exactly what you do when you wake up from sleep. You bring your awareness back into your body and re-engage with your nervous systems and your fingers. Oh, my body is feeling a little dull. It's not so sensitive somehow. It's there's too much inertia. And I bring it back into wakefulness. What did I do? I entered the awareness and then shifted until the body state changed. So I reread this sentence now, and you see what he conveys. He is aware of himself also, even individually, as a center of the divine existence, a portion of the Lord, the Gita expresses it, controlling so far the action of nature which he views, upholds, sanctions, enjoys, knows, and by the determinative power of knowledge, controls. And now comes the next idea, how far can this go? And when he universalizes himself, his knowledge reflects only the divine knowledge. Now remember, what was the key to the widening was your awareness, your knowledge. Through the knowing came the power of controlling. What happens when you universalize your consciousness? This knowing part of yourself also begins to widen. So, and it joins with what? When he universalizes himself, his knowledge reflects only the divine knowledge. What is the power or consciousness which sustains this whole universe and its working? If we can do this with our body, or extend beyond our body even to other things, who or what is upholding this whole universe, not only as witness, not only upholder, not only as sanction giver, but also enjoyer and the master with his knowledge? It's the divine consciousness, upholding the whole universe in a poise which is of knowledge. And we will call that the omniscient knowledge of his consciousness. And in the power of that knowledge, to determine, it is also omnipotent. Between the two, omnipotence and omniscience, the key is always in the knowledge. As you grow in the knowledge aspect, the potency of the knowledge activates more and more. Who holds that? The divine, supporting the whole universe. And so when your knowledge, which is a tiny part of the divine, now widens, what does it widen into? You don't have a separate knowledge. There is already the divine knowledge of which you were a part. You only open yourself to the divine knowledge. You did not expand your knowledge. You did not accumulate your knowledge. You opened yourself by removing limits to experience the wholeness of knowledge, of which your limits had put a narrow, cut out part, which you called your knowledge or your consciousness. Again, here is implied the key in the yoga practice, which the mother explains in this way. She says, you cannot reach out and grab the divine consciousness. You cannot pull the divine consciousness like a piece and reduce it to your own little quantum of limit. Or, as Sri Aurobindo describes, what does the asura do? He tries to widen and aggrandize his own little consciousness until it can become as big as the universe. That's not how it works. What rather you do, the mother says, is you open and give yourself to the divine consciousness. It fills you. It removes your boundaries and joins you into itself. It's no more you becoming big like the divine, it is rather you dissolving and losing your separateness and ego into the divine. And it is this which is the movement of universalizing. So rather than I trying to control in my limited knowledge, which is okay for the ego, as I universalize, I let go and join into the divine knowledge that upholds everything. So, his knowledge reflects only the divine knowledge. Why does he use the word reflect? Because you're still operating as an individual unit. So you open out in consciousness, that vaster knowledge which upholds the universe reflects in you. And it's as if accessible to you in your unit of focus. You're still a part, a portion of the divine. And second, his will effectuates only the divine will. So what do you will into it? As long as you're separate, you will. When you join into the divine consciousness, whose will is flowing through you? It is the divine will that wills you to be in the first place. And so wills through you whatever has to happen. And as you remove the boundaries of separateness which distort the divine flow of the divine will, it flows, its will. His will effects only the divine will. And what was the enjoyment you had so far? Where does it join? He enjoys only the divine delight and not an ignorant personal satisfaction. Ignorant meaning limited. And with limitation, remember we saw last time, it fragments the joy into pain, pleasure, sadness, happiness. And when thus we rejoin with the whole, there is already the divine delight, of which now you share through this unit. He enjoys only the divine delight. Thus, the Purusha preserves its freedom in its possession. You still possess, but now from this poise of freedom. Renunciation of limited personality, even in its representative enjoyment and delight of cosmic being. You still retain this limited personality as the focus of your action while enjoying the delight of the cosmic being, no more bound to the limitation that this has. You may still act as the focal point while sharing in the cosmic enjoyment. And we may give again an analogy here of what that means. Let's say you're part of a gigantic project where everybody is working towards a common goal. And you can see progressively as a team, we're growing towards it. I am still doing my limited focus of action and responsibility, but I share in the joy of our collective success and growth. And that's the sense we have. The knowledge is reflecting the divine knowledge. You're aware of all that's happening, why it's happening. Your will is fulfilling the divine will, and your enjoyment is cosmic even as your focus is individual. It has taken up fully in the higher poise the true relations of the soul and nature. And this higher poise is where you are in a liberated consciousness, enjoying the play of nature from a poise of mastery, no more formed by nature, no more dependent or limited by her. This is the culmination of the discussion that we have had of the relationship between soul and nature and the ascent of that relationship. Now Sri Aurobindo joins this with the origin itself of all cosmos in the oneness of the Satchidananda. But just before we move that, in this poise where this joining has been complete, go back 2 more pages, and we saw Sri Aurobindo had already described in detail what happens when you do this. And in the universalizing, he says, you're in control over the environment, and the world increases as you universalize this poise of mastery from the individual. This it can only do by universalizing itself, for it is the divine and universal will that it must express in its action upon the world. And how? He says, it must first extend its consciousness and see the universe in itself, instead of being like the mind, limited by the physical, vital, sensational, emotional, intellectual outlook of the little divided personality. It must accept the world truths, the world energies, the world tendencies, the world purposes as its own, instead of clinging to its own intellectual ideas, desires, endeavors, preferences, objects, intentions, impulses. These, so far as they remain, must be harmonized with the universal. He must then submit its knowledge and will at their very source to the divine knowledge and the divine will. And so arrive through submission at emergence, losing its personal delight in the divine light, losing its personal light in the divine light and its personal initiative in the divine initiative. We had read all this, now you will recall, but you see how the passage we have now studied is the means by which you attain to this. And then he completed there, to be first in tune with the infinite, in harmony with the divine, and then to be unified with the infinite, taken into the divine, is the condition of perfect strength and mastery. And this is precisely the very nature of the spiritual life and spiritual existence. And so now we have come to this poise where you can actually have the perfect strength and mastery while working through this narrow individual frame of personality, but living in a consciousness that has the knowledge and therefore the effective power and the delight of the cosmos working through you and in your life. So having completed this now as the poise we should come to, and the right relationship of the soul and nature being set, where did these two come from? What was their origin? And what is the unity from which they emerge? Can we actually recognize this continuity of oneness in their play all the way from top down? And this is a fascinating description what he gives you here. Next. Purusha and Prakriti, in their union and duality, arise from the being of Satchidananda. How? Self-conscious existence is the essential nature of the being. That is Sat or Purusha. The power of self-aware existence, whether drawn into itself or acting in works of its consciousness and forces, its knowledge and its will, Chit and Tapas, Chit and its Shakti, that is Prakriti. We'll come back to this, but see the third step. Delight of being, Ananda, is the eternal truth of the union of this conscious being and its conscious force, whether absorbed in itself or else deployed in the inseparable duality of its two aspects. Unrolling the worlds and viewing them, acting in them and upholding the action, executing works and giving the sanction without which the force of nature cannot act, executing and controlling the knowledge and the will, and knowing and controlling the determinations of the knowledge force and will force, ministering to the enjoyment and enjoying. And he goes on a little more. But you see now this absolutely grand vision from the original Satchidananda, which is pure being, that is Sat, is the consciousness of being which is utterly aware of itself. And then in that awareness is the power of it to become, to manifest itself. And in that is the play of the delight, not only to be, but to pour out and manifest itself. This is Satchidananda. And this is what you see unfolding in this, what appears to us as a duality of soul and nature. The consciousness of Sat, of pure being, is the poise, the status of the witness or Purusha, the center of you, that you are. And it can change in grade of consciousness, it can rise up, being a mental conscious being, to even higher and higher grades of consciousness in our evolution, until we live in the pure consciousness of the Sat. But that's the ascent of the Purusha. And at the same time as there is this consciousness of being, of Satchidananda, there is the power of the consciousness which dwells upon itself and says, oh, I am this, I am that, and I can be all this. And that power dwelling in the consciousness brings out, makes objective, unrolls the world, so to say, draws out all its powers and plays them, deploying them. And this is a creative force of consciousness, of the being, which is flowing out. And as it pours out, remember, it is power of consciousness, but it is always consciousness of being, which is the power. And so in every movement of the power as it unfolds, there is hidden behind it the consciousness and the being. And therefore in everything that emerges in the universe is an individual sense of consciousness, an individual sense of being. The galaxy which is thrown out like that in a casual, massive, stupendous whirl of energy is an expression of consciousness which is being, and is conscious galaxy. As a being, as a person, unfolding, unveiling over time the personality in which this was thrown out. And another thrown out in a different gesture, unfolding that personality. And each of the galaxies or super galaxies thrown out from the divine, reflecting or representing, unfolding an aspect of the divine delight of knowing himself as this. That's the conscious being of the galaxy, full of delight, bliss of consciousness. And inside that is the whirl of all the solar systems and the suns and the planets. Again, each of which has its own particular quality of delight of consciousness and being. And therefore our earth has a unique being. She is this mother. Other planets are very different. Mars is the warrior, very masculine. Mercury is this very fine, fluid, restless energy of personality. It wants to do a lot of things. It's like the intellect which is trying to make sense of things. Jupiter has this character of being like a wise old man with great wisdom, looking upon space and time, like a philosopher. And each of these planets has a character which molds the type of the people that grow on it and the lives that form in it, or which nourish themselves from it. If we were to transplant ourselves upon Mars for long enough, we would begin to acquire the character of that planetary consciousness. Or if beings evolved there, they would have the character of that consciousness. And if they met us, we would feel them to be somehow different. They don't feel like they're earth people, because they don't have that earth consciousness. And we would feel the difference, and they would feel the difference. And each of these units is being which is conscious, which is expressing an aspect of its delight, down to every unit, including the flower and the tree and the cells in the flower and the bacteria which is near the cell, and down to the atom and the subatomic particle, which is each of them a whirl of delight of Satchidananda. Now when you see this gigantic picture of Satchidananda deploying itself, the aspect of Sat supporting consciousness and being is Purusha. Everywhere there is Purusha. In the atom there is the Purusha supporting the movement of Prakriti and the delight of force of consciousness. In the flower is flower Purusha supporting the delight of the whirl of energy of consciousness that is flower. And so on, all the way to the human. The human is more complex because we have so many layers and parts, and so we have many poises of Purusha. The primary poise which we are aware of is the poise of mind, separating itself, and so it is the mental poise of Purusha, standing back, observing its own thoughts and having emotions and body, which is the most common, into which we can station ourselves most easily. But from there, the Purusha can also know all this, not only from the reading, but by direct experience. And then it can turn and say, what is supporting me and my poise of consciousness? And it can awaken to its own deeper status of the Purusha, the self, the poise of the self. Or what is it that has been carrying the journey of these lives, and it can separate itself, take the poise of the psychic being, the conscious soul within who has been incarnating, and then from there step back to the self, supporting from its timeless Purusha status, the journey of this psychic being, soul across lives. But this is your first reference to stepping back and then to going deeper. But all this Sri Aurobindo is giving you as this gigantic vision. Purusha and Prakriti, in their union and duality, arise from the being of Satchidananda. Now, what does he mean, union and duality? You will see at each step he will describe that this power to express can also be held back and turn into itself as if dreaming internally. Or it can be deployed and turned outward to manifest as if externally. Both the movement inward as well as the movement outward, in both it is still Purusha and Prakriti in their union and in their duality, arise from the being of Satchidananda. And what is that? Self-conscious existence is the essential nature of the being. Remember, in the beginning there is only that. Indescribable reality, unknowable even. But it, bound by no limits and therefore not knowable or describable by mind, it can know itself. And the very first power by which it knows itself is this power, I am, the being, it exists, the Sat aspect. And then it knows that it is conscious of its being, and that's the Chit aspect. And the consciousness of its self-knowing is blissful, is the Ananda aspect. But all three are merged, one in the other. The very knowing is blissful, the consciousness is the bliss. Bliss is the knowing and the consciousness and the being. You cannot separate them. So we say Satchidananda, one word. You can also, in its consciousness, dwell upon each of these separately. I am, and I am conscious, and I am blissfully conscious. So you can have the Sat and the Chit and the Ananda as if highlighted to the experience. But they can never be separated. So there's the union, and then there is also the sense of separation, but they're never really separate in Sat, Chit, Ananda. But in the poise of Purusha, it is the poise of Sat, which is conscious, and then the energy of the consciousness, the Chit Shakti, is the Prakriti. So, self-conscious existence is the essential nature of the being. I am conscious, I exist. That is it. That is Sat or Purusha. And the other side, the power of self-aware existence. I'm aware that I exist and I can be so many things. That's the power. Whether drawn into itself or acting in the works of its consciousness and force. So this can say, I am aware of all these possibilities, but I choose to remain silent. I am aware of all these possibilities and I begin to dwell on them and explore them and draw them out in relation to each other. And so these are the works of what? Of its awareness and the force of its awareness, pouring out, so to say. Its knowledge, in the awareness as it draws out these possibilities, the detailed knowledge of each of these and the relationships, and the will by which it places them in relation to each other. All that is there in a single movement, never separate. I am aware, and what I am aware, I will, I am. No separation. So it's knowledge and its will. And then he uses the Sanskrit terms Chit and Tapas. Consciousness and concentration of consciousness. Chit and its Shakti, the consciousness and its power to effectuate. That is Prakriti. So Purusha is the Sat a part of the consciousness, and Prakriti is the energy of the consciousness pouring out. If that energy was held within, their union is seen. When that energy is released, their duality is seen. But all the time the energy is held in the oneness, and the oneness is in the energy, and they're never really separate, even though they play at the sense of separateness. And always with Sat and Chit and the power of Chit, there is the delight which can never be separated. And so what is the form the delight takes place in this duality? Delight of being, Ananda, is the eternal truth of the union of this conscious being and its conscious force, whether absorbed in itself or else deployed in the inseparable duality of its two aspects. So when the consciousness holds all its possibilities of force within, it is blissfully aware of itself. I am all these things potentially. And when it deploys itself, it is blissfully aware of the movement. I am the bliss that pours out in all these possibilities. And always they are one inseparably in the bliss, even when they play out in a duality of its two aspects. And what happens when it moves into duality of two aspects? The play between them is still blissful at each of these 6 facets of relationship that we have just studied. And this is what he describes now, but this is on a cosmic scale. You see the pouring out of Satchidananda to become the worlds and the play of the two aspects. Unrolling the worlds. Who is unrolling? The Chit Shakti aspect, the energy, power aspect. And viewing them, which is the past aspect viewing, the consciousness of being viewing, and the power of consciousness unrolling. Both are blissful. The power of consciousness unrolling the worlds, blissfully unrolling. The consciousness observing is blissfully observing, and their relationship, their meeting, is also blissful. So, unrolling the worlds and viewing them in its two aspects. Acting in them and upholding the action. So the next level, one was, remember, support, the witness. The next is, there's an action now taking place in the unfolding. The galaxies are formed and whirling, and this witness now takes the poise of the upholder, upholding the action. Because the witness upholds, therefore the galaxies form. Executing the works and giving the sanction, without which the force of nature cannot act. So, here nature works out the fine action as she arranges all the galaxies and their world and the solar systems. And then this is sanctioning, yes, yes, yes. And occasionally it says, not this, more of that, less of this. Everywhere the sanction is for life to burst out. Everywhere the sanction is for the play to grow forward. If you observe physical nature and physical matter particularly, you will see everything declining eventually. Everything breaks down, everything degenerates, everything breaks up, everything eventually decomposes. And if that was all, there would be no universe. But equally as there is this breakdown and decomposition, out of the blue the seed sprouts and the tree grows from the decomposed matter. And again life bursts out. Why? Because the sanction is more of life, less of the breakdown. Yes, the breakdown is allowed as long as it supports life and the progress of life. So every time life reaches some limit of its formation and capacity, okay, you are allowed to break down so that we may burst out stronger, more capable. And so evolution is pushed forward by this aspect supporting, not just upholding, but giving sanction, without which the force of nature cannot act. And so there's an active aspect supporting this forward movement of evolution. Now, if you look at the Trinity, which is seen in the Puranic tradition, there is Brahma, the creator, Vishnu, the upholder, and Shiva, described as destroyer. But it's not really destroyer, it is the breakdown to burst out afresh. And so, transformer is the correct word. And you will see all three poises here. There is the poise that has chosen to burst out in delight and the creative movement. There is this poise which is supporting all that activity. And then there is the poise which is sanctioning, not just sanctioning, but actively pushing a certain direction of the upward evolution. Executing works and giving the sanction without which the force of nature cannot act. Executing and controlling the knowledge and the will. And knowing and controlling the determinations of the knowledge force and will force. And so this is now getting richly into the detail. Down to the tiniest detail, the knowledge is there, the awareness and the will which emerges from it, which is working itself out perfectly. Therefore, we see in nature this extraordinary intelligence. In the tiniest movement here that nature does to nudge an atom in a particular direction, there is the full knowledge of the entire cosmos, which is supporting from behind. And so the atom in its single movement is perfectly aligned with everything else. As it moves, everything else moves. And physics looks at it and says, how do you explain this? From a pure consciousness view, it is extraordinarily beautiful miracle of the free play of the divine. The physics comes and says, every time the atom moves, the universe changes. Aha, there is a force acting between them. There is a law which is somehow controlling them. But you can see how superficial this view is. You have imposed a mentally constructed explanation for something which is so deep and rich as to be beyond your mind's conception. That in a single movement of the atom being forced, there is the knowledge of the whole which adjusts the force of all the play of the whole universe instantaneously. There is no action between atom and those things. That is only an appearance. We will say phenomenon. So there is this whole phenomena that our human mind sees and tries to construct out of it an explanation. But what is behind it is a free play of the blissful self-expression of the infinite one. Through this duality of Purusha, Prakriti, supporting poise of consciousness and the deploying power of consciousness. So executing and controlling the knowledge and the will, and knowing and controlling the determinations of the knowledge force and will force. What happens? You control the knowledge and will through this poise of supporting. But what emerges from that knowledge and will, and this is what he is pointing to, determinations of it. Meaning, when this knowledge moves in this particular way or supports in this way, and the will moves in that particular way, what's the outcome? A galaxy will form, a planet will emerge, life will burst out, the plant will grow, the human will form and think. The determination out of that whole working, eventually the universe will awaken to its own divinity and consciously participate in this blissful play. And what is to be the outcome is already held in the determination as the knowledge and the will looks at it. Ministering to the enjoyment and enjoying. The soul, possessor, observer, knower, lord of nature. But wait, we will come to the soul later. Ministering to the enjoyment and enjoying. The two aspects of nature. One is ministering to the enjoyment, the other is enjoying. Each of these sentences you will see where nature and soul, nature and soul. Who's ministering to the enjoyment? Nature. Who's enjoying? the soul or Purusha. What is the word ministering? It's not minister as we think of it as a person in authority. It's in fact the opposite. In the original root in Latin, it is the servant, the one who assists. And so there is the sense of giving, serving, but also providing nourishment, providing material in the original sense of the word. So it is used in this way, ministering to what? To the enjoyment. And who's the enjoyer? The soul. So nature is as if deploying all this for what? For the purpose of the Sat consciousness, which enjoys all this, its own deployment by its own power, who then turns to minister to its enjoyment, and it enjoys. And this is the nature of Satchidananda. We have the most beautiful picture of the universe now, from the oneness and the bliss, the movement of the deploying and the double status, each of which is itself, is the Satchidananda, taking these two aspects for the play. They never separate. Their bliss is always in the play and in the union. When they are held within each other and when they are deployed in a duality, always it is the same bliss which is unfolding. Inside this play, there is the individual soul, the aspect of Sat that now grows out of this evolving unit. The human being, we who are looking and reading this and looking at this big picture. Where did I come from? Who am I? Where am I going? And this soul, the soul, possessor, observer, knower, lord of nature, nature expressing the being, executing the will, satisfying the self-knowledge, ministering to the delight of being of the soul. Now that same play which is in the Satchidananda in the cosmic scale is now replicated in the soul and the nature. So the soul is possessing, in this awakened state, it possesses. I hold this mind, life, body and the movement around me of this gigantic whirl. So first possessor, and it observes. And it's observing, poise is that saying, I am not this, but I am enjoying this. So, observer, knower. I know that all this is my own power working out. Lord of nature. I exercise that power which is working out. You see, the sequence is totally different from the awakened poise. First, possessor, then observer, knower and lord of nature. Just as an analogy, and now analogies will fail, but still we will use it. When you are the landlord of this building and this gigantic property, you know it is yours, you can do what you like with it. You've grown up with that authority, or the king, or the inheritor of this, what your grandfather worked for, whatever it is. Okay, so taking a very human example. What happens when you enter that property? I am possessor. I hold the title deed of it. It's mine. The first relationship you have. Okay? And then from possessor, observer. Okay, which is the extent of my space? And that's the observer status. Knower. Now that I've observed, I know what it is. Yes, this is my building, this is my garden, that is my whatever. And now I choose to make these changes, I choose to arrange this, I choose to realign. And so from knower comes Lord of nature. On the other side, when the soul has this experience of its space, I am possessor of this body. I observe, okay, these are the limits of its working. I know, and now I begin to exercise. As I begin to exercise it, I discover these are the limits, but I know I can go beyond these limits. So I begin to stretch my body and push it beyond the limits. I make it more capable than what it used to be because I know I am this and this has to reflect me. Do you see the sequence is fascinating when you see from the liberated consciousness? On the other side, what is nature doing to the Purusha? Nature expressing the being. Whatever I am, she tries to express. When you feel happy, what do? You laugh. Did you think of which muscle to pull? No, the joy somehow worked out and nature expressed your happiness and joy. I am so happy I can't contain myself, I start dancing and singing. Are you conscious of every little movement? No, it's your body is expressing the joy that you carry. Nature is expressing the being. And within that next step, executing the will. I say, no, this dance is not too elegant. I will a change and nature follows. I will to drink water, nature follows with my hand. I'm not conscious of all the muscles which are moving for the synchronization. That's nature doing, executing my individual will. And satisfying the self-knowledge. What is she trying to do? Where does she stop? Only when I say, yes, this is good. When I reach the point of satisfaction, then nature says, okay, this is where I stop. Otherwise, she continues to adjust, to modify until she reflects the will and brings it to satisfaction. And ministering to the delight of being of the soul. And through all this, she is trying to bring and give and nourish the delight of being of the soul. Except it's not this mind which is the true soul that she is ministering to, but the psychic being within. The true person who is immortal, who is the divine portion of the divine within. And she is working to nourish that and to bring the delight of that and to fulfill that. And therefore it happens. When the soul within feels the personality is going off track, something is not okay, I feel suffocated by this tendency of the mind and emotions which are locked in this narrowness, the soul aspires to be free. And nature responds by giving you a wham that breaks, shatters you, shocks you, awakens you in a shock. To what? Okay, I need to change myself, I need to improve, I need to change something. Because the shock of what I was in my nature was that it was unacceptable, forces me now to make that effort in the surface parts. So here we are in the mind, we are in a bit of a confused state. We reflect something of the Purusha consciousness, but not the true Purusha. We reflect something of it in the mind. And so we have this partial control, and we are trying to control and manage with difficulty. When this Purusha rejoins with the true Purusha, that same movement becomes almost effortless and spontaneous. But nature is working all the time for this. So I'll reread this line. You see how it describes soul and nature. The soul, possessor, observer, knower, lord of nature. Nature, expressing the being, executing the will, satisfying the self-knowledge, ministering to the delight of being of the soul. And all the time behind it is this sustaining delight. Most obviously experienced from the poise of the psychic being which looks at the whole world and says, what a beautiful playground. I'm going to have lots of fun playing here across so many lives and so many personalities and such fascinating experiences. And it's still a delight. And the growth at each step through every experience is also a delight in the growth. There we have founded, there meaning here in the Satchidananda, there we have founded on the very nature of being, the supreme and universal relation of Prakriti and Purusha. The absolute joy of the soul in itself, and based upon that, the absolute joy of the soul in nature are the divine fulfillment of the relation. So in this last sentence he is describing in the poise of that oneness of Satchidananda, this double poise of consciousness of being and power of the consciousness of being. There we have founded on the very nature of being, the supreme and universal relation of Prakriti and Purusha. What's the nature of being? Conscious delight. And in conscious delight is the power of the consciousness and the delight of the unfolding of that power. On this base is the true relation. And the absolute joy of the soul in itself, when it dwells without needing to deploy its power, and based upon that, the absolute joy of the soul in nature as it plays in the working of nature. This absolute joy are the divine fulfillment of the relation. And when soul and nature re-enter their life right relation, both experience this absolute joy of the play. And with this he completes the chapter. What he has accomplished in this chapter, remember, was showing how the underlying sense of oneness of the Satchidananda exists in every principle in the universe. And he took as an example the first, most difficult principle to unite, soul and nature. Showed us not only how their contradictory relationship can ascend to their true relation, but the true relation itself comes from the Satchidananda's oneness and the Sat and the Chit and the Ananda deploying in this double position to make possible the unrolling of the worlds and the play of the delight in this unrolling. What he did now is, having shown us the oneness from above, which fills the whole universe, he has taken this division and stitched it up. Like a zip from the oneness, he has taken it all the way down. Now we can see that soul and nature, Purusha and Prakriti, from top down are really one, and their play is a blissful play all the way down to the most material, separate seeming, contradictory appearing relationship of soul and nature. And suddenly all reality becomes this grand, unified one with a double aspect, and always behind it underlying the play. The next chapter is titled The Soul and Its Liberation. And here he says, once you've seen this and recognized this, the very purpose of the yoga undergoes a change. If soul and nature are one essentially, you cannot speak of liberation of soul alone. Leaving behind its nature somehow limited, in ignorance, warped, distorted, darkened, cannot be. If they are one and you speak of liberation of the one, the other also must undergo its liberation for the true union of the delight to be experienced on all levels. And so that will be the theme for the next chapter. We can pause here and take any questions or comments. It is such an extraordinary vision, isn't it? And with such practical implications in our lives, not only for the internal practice of the yoga, but also our exercise of freedom and mastery in the world. Yes.
I have a question about the poise that I take towards others.
Mm-hmm.
And for example, I'm in charge of 3 young, older boys leading to a yoga class, for example, and they are nervous, excited, shy. What really is my poise there?
Yes. So what would be the poise in our relation with others from this perspective? Well, the first most obvious thing we see, every individual is a soul in evolution. As much as you are a soul in evolution. And that changes the relationship. Strictly speaking, although I may have greater authority in the arrangement externally, I recognize we are equally souls in evolution. And especially if they are children, I may have greater responsibility at that moment. But in status of consciousness, I see them equally. I can learn as much from them as they can learn from me. So first is that shift. Second, in their growth, since you're responsible for their growth to some extent, you recognize within them there is this struggle between the soul and nature and the unawakened relationship. The true relationship is not yet developed. And their struggle in life is really first to come into their own as a conscious being, and then to master their own nature and set right this broken relationship. And if you think of it from this perspective, you will know what you need to do, where you need to help them become conscious, and where you need to help them to be able to control, and how to control or master their own nature. The most important thing you would do is first observe. Observe what's happening. Bring what is happening inside them into your domain of knowledge. Remember, that's how you will gain influence in that space. As you become conscious of what's happening inside them, your poise will automatically affect that. And so the most effective teachers, the most effective leaders, even taking a general context, are those whose very presence in the room makes everything start working smoothly and automatically. They come in and somehow things start falling into place. Why? Because they hold everything in the right knowledge within them. And you will see this happen very distinctly. The same children in a different space become chaotic. They come into your space and they become so interested and attuned to what's happening, and they collaborate and work together. Or when you are disturbed, that disturbance reflects in them, and you'll notice that. Next, what you will do is, even as you shift, your intention will be to assist them to grow more conscious of what's happening within them. So you will, by contagion, so to say, awaken in them a higher grade of consciousness. And the idea is this: when you're more aware, they will tend to become more aware. You will, of course, utilize external means to make them conscious of things, not only in their behavior, but also in the factual contents. Oh, notice how this is happening, understand this. They are external means, but the goal is still awakening the consciousness within them, including their consciousness of the world. So when you're studying a textbook of history or geography, what are you really doing? A part of your consciousness is being taught of those spaces which are beyond your physical senses. And those things begin to come into your consciousness, and a part of you, at least in the mind, begins to expand. So you'll be assisting from that view. See, everything that's happening in the teaching space can be seen from the increasing right relation of the Purusha awakening and the Prakriti also growing to match that awakening.
I need a practical hint about being a witness. Like as the Karma Yoga goes, be perfect and make perfect action. And for that, focus and concentration is required. And keeping that in mind, and we have still to be a witness. So what is the practical hint to go about?
Okay. So in the particular process of Karma Yoga, you may not begin by taking a witness position. You may begin by the idea that a part of you that is semi-witness is consciously offering the results of the work, which is the easiest to offer, and then later increasingly even the work itself. And you will do that in the beginning and at the end. So before you start the work, you step back, semi-witness, look at the work you're going to do and make an offering of it, then plunge into the work. At the end of the work, again you step back, witness, semi-witness, offer the efforts made and the resulting outcome whenever, wherever, however they happen. So you are taking momentary step back, beginning and end. If this is continued and the sense of the bhava, the mood, now becomes more and more prominent within your consciousness, you will find something of this poise will begin to seep into the work state effortlessly. So you're doing the work and suddenly you become conscious that, this is why I'm doing it. I'm doing it as an offering. Easiest to do in a mechanical work where your mind is not directly involved. But you start with something very simple, mechanical, and infuse that tendency or that orientation of your consciousness. As a result, automatically you begin to notice a part of you which is aware that you're doing this as an offering, and the rest of you that is involved. The separation will begin, and then you will only consciously intensify that poise. I become more conscious that I'm doing this as an offering. And the state of the witness and the separation between that and the activity will become more and more distinct. But at first you do it only in the beginning and end, where you can separate yourself. Afterwards, a kind of a double status happens, where a part is holding that poise of consecration, and the other part is involved. And interestingly, the consecration poise is not so much in the mind, it settles more in the heart. So your mind will be engaged. I'm doing some very complicated analysis, and then I stop and I come back to my awareness and I realize, in the heart the poise of consecration was still there. So it's useful, the mother suggests, to take many brief pauses in the work. So every hour or so, you have a timer on your phone which goes beep, you pause, separate yourself, remember, offer, re-engage. Or every time you have a break where you have to get up from your chair, you pause, remember and offer. Every time you have to sit, you come back, sit, take that moment, and then re-engage. That's how you would begin practically.
Shalalu, what is a master of Shraddha?
Explain.
You explained the name about Shraddha, but last time I remember you tell nobody know who is a master of Shraddha. What's in that
Shraddha. You mean Shraddha?
Shraddha.
The faith. Okay. Yes, okay. Okay. So when we have this experience that I know I am, it's as a part of the divine, what Sri Aurobindo described. He is aware of himself also, even individually, as a center of the divine existence, a portion of the Lord. And therefore what I have become aware of within me, this goodness which is me, is a portion of the Lord's goodness. This sense of the sacred that I have, of the divine presence that is within me, is a part of the sacred reality, which is the Satchidananda and the sacredness of the whole, of which this is a part. This is a temple in the cosmic temple. And so it is the sense of a portion of the divine that we experience, and that's where the faith, Shraddha, is felt. But that, Sri Aurobindo says, is all potential. The divine puts forward a part of itself as a psychic being, but because it is a part of the divine, the full power of divine potentiality, infinite potentiality, is present like the tree hides in the seed. You do not see it in the form, but in the knowledge and the power of the knowledge, the full potentiality is captured there. And so when it deploys, it can go in any direction that is freely chosen.
My question is,
Yes.
master of Shraddha, but one time Roger
Is the divine.
you are integral faith.
Yes.
It's true.
Yes.
Inside
Yes.
means
Yes.
thank you.
Okay.
The divine doesn't stop creating.
Mhm.
It creates and creates and creates. All the souls creates
Mhm.
more and more and more souls. So do they come all on the material plane? Do they
Mhm.
decide to take a body eventually?
Mhm.
Or do the majority stay somewhere in the soul world and they don't
Yes.
take a body?
Yes.
Because now we are on earth and
Mhm.
it's
Yes.
being here, we got pretty crowded.
Yes. And of course, our earth is a very small part of the whole universe, and you have trillions upon trillions of planets. But yes, it's a very important point that from the divine consciousness, every possibility which exists as a potentially can emerge to express itself in unending time and space. And if it can, it does eventually, including every line of development of experience which is possible. And so with it, every part of the divine that bursts out to say, I want to experience this, is a soul in the unfolding space and time. Not all of them need to take birth in matter. They could also emerge as beings who work on other planes of existence and worlds within those planes. Now, for example, in the mental world, anything that you can conceive of is, in consciousness at least, an entire world of that character of consciousness, and infinite in its scope. And beings can move out to play in those spaces. Sri Aurobindo explains that in those worlds you can have growth, but evolution as we have it here is something unique to matter. You have to get into something which is blocking all possibilities in limited form for that infinite possibility to be able to emerge out of it for the experience of evolution. That is, out of dead matter comes living matter, which becomes conscious, which becomes thinking, which becomes divine, etc. But if you entered the mental plane or the vital plane, you would experience the wonders of that grade of consciousness and grow in that grade towards some ideal or divine possibility. But it would always be in that kind of consciousness, rather than as here from zero you can have infinity emerging. So there's a particularly challenging aspect to the entry into the physical life and the physical evolution, which not all beings may accept to do. And there are many souls which are happy to play in those worlds, and sometimes some of them are attracted to the human experience and say, what would it be like? Oh, it's scary, it's pretty dark, it's difficult. And so among them often there is this sense that those who choose to enter the physical world are seen like heroes. So human soul having passed on, the other being says, oh, you're from the earth plane, wow, it's something amazing. And some of them get fascinated and say, well, let me see what it's like. And they may put out a part of their consciousness to align with a human being and see, I give him a little bit of my inspiration and then he gives me a little bit of the experience of growth. And so they share sometimes. And there are many complex links like that which form, sometimes temporarily. But Mother said that those, especially the higher beings who are attracted to the earth plane and seek to engage with earth things. She put it in the context of gods, godlike beings, and even asuric beings. They are often in the mental plane. Very powerful beings, but those who are attracted to interfere in earth affairs are those who are often destined to take births to experience this evolution. But yes, the universe is huge complexity of so many infinities of worlds. Even just as the physical plane alone is full of infinities of planets. So there's a huge canvas of all kinds of possibilities.
And she said that Earth is a significant center of evolution.
Yes.
But she never said, I don't remember, that it is the only one. If there could be more significant
So,
centers of evolution.
yes, yes,
So we may have it may go on
yes.
other planets or galaxies that we can here.
We have to be careful of what is meant by the word earth. You'll see most... but what do we mean by the word earth? So in most of the writings of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, because their focus was this planet, by earth they meant the physical domain. So take birth on earth, a being from another plane taking birth on earth means taking birth in a physical body. Most of their discussion was like that. Occasionally they use the word earth in context of other planets. And in that case, we recognize that life is everywhere, evolution is everywhere on all planets, well, to whatever extent it supports life, and trillions of them do. But their Mother said our earth has a special place because it is the focal point for the psychic individualization in evolution. And that is something special about this physical earth.
That's my question.
Yes.
When it's actually being on Earth, is that possible on other sources?
Absolutely. So,
It is possible that we have psychic being manifesting on other planets.
absolutely. yes. So let's explain that a little bit. It's a fascinating area of exploration. What happens on Earth, you will see two kinds of evolution. There is the individual evolution where the soul, each time incarnating, brings a little bit of its new growth. And then there is a evolution of the species. The species is improving through many generations. And the two they're different, but they support each other. Okay? Now you take another species like the bees. They have a species evolution through birth. There's an improvement in their genetic stock. But you do not see individual evolution in the individual bees because they are a group hive consciousness where the queen bee holds the individuality. Now that consciousness may evolve as an individual as the hive evolves. And that we could say is the center of its psychic identity. And that could over time emerge into the human as a psychic being. But it would be the whole hive consciousness as a whole. Now if you capture this possibility here on Earth, then on other planets equally, there may be groups which have, so to say, the shared group consciousness with an individualized psychic being. But not in all of them. They would all rely on this queen bee center to hold their identity, so to say, for the spiritual evolution. But they would still have the normal biological evolution and evolution of mind and other things. So when they come to Earth, what do they see that's different? On Earth, every human being has a separate psychic individuality. Wow, that's not the case back home on our planet. Okay, so there are groups often. And sometimes the entire planetary consciousness may have a special kind of individuality. The difference it would make practically is this, that where you have this kind of a collective hive consciousness, they don't have much problem of conflict, at least within the hive. The queen bee decides the worker bees and the warrior bees and the nurturing bees are all doing their job. It's almost like one big machine, automatically in harmony. But if two queen bees meet, there might be a conflict. Whereas on Earth, because every individual almost has a formed psychic individuality, we have a great problem of organizing ourselves as a team. And so this problem does not exist for them to such a degree. When they look at our planet, they say, these human beings are a pretty chaotic type. They're struggling with problems which we don't have. But they're fascinated by it because they don't know what it's like to have this. And some of them do take birth even in this Earth, although their primary evolution may be on a different planet. If they're visiting from another planet, they're coming with what their consciousness has. They evolve, but they evolve more in a collective movement than just an individual. If they have the psychic being who is of the group soul, that is evolving and that will grow. But unlike our birth, where my psychic being now sheds this body, takes another body to continue evolution, in their case, their center of the psychic being may shift from one body to another. When this queen bee dies, the psychic consciousness moves to the next who becomes the queen bee. And there may not be for the psychic being the same sense of going back to take a rebirth. It will simply shift bodies in the collectivity of the community soul and move like that. So there are many variations to evolution from a soul's perspective. And our Earth is unique for this particular special focus of the psychic being. Even here, the mother referred to certain human groupings where she said the individualized psychic being was not there. But that's very rare.
She said the whole country.
Yes.
So if they're not evolving.
No, they're evolving. Everybody is evolving.
Yeah, but it's good.
So three things. First, consciousness evolving. You grow in awareness, in quality of mind, and in higher and higher levels of mental consciousness. And separate from that is the biological evolution, which provides a container which is more resilient, better, more plastic, etc. And third is the individual psychic being, which can then also use these two vehicles of evolution for its purpose. But there can be a group consciousness which is evolving as a group, over time getting more intelligent, more conscious, more awake, more expressive of all the powers of consciousness.
Can they acquire psychic being?
Yes, yes, because the psychic being can use any human body as a vehicle if it so chooses to enter there. Which was the point she made also about certain spaces where it was not there, that there was a mixture and after that it's no more the same. But what happens when you go to a group like that, maybe you see 100 people, you can immediately recognize, oh, this, they are conscious as individuals. The others are part of some kind of a group consciousness. They stand out. But then if that is there in a few, it can grow eventually. So we will come back to this grand vision. Self-conscious existence is the essential nature of the being, that is Sat or Purusha. The power of self-aware existence, consciousness and force, knowledge and will, that is Prakriti. Delight of being, Ananda, is the eternal truth of the union of this conscious being and its conscious force. Whether absorbed in itself or else deployed in the inseparable duality of its two aspects, unrolling the worlds and viewing them, acting in them, upholding the action, executing the works and giving sanction, controlling the determinations, ministering to the enjoyment and enjoying. The soul, possessor, observer, knower, lord of nature. Nature expressing the being, executing the will, satisfying the self-knowledge, ministering to the delight of being of the soul. The absolute joy of the soul in itself, and based upon that, the absolute joy of the soul in nature, are the divine fulfillment of the relation. We will take up the next chapter next Friday.